Alright, so this is number 6, clip number 6 for chapter 2 on inflation. So I want to finish up this sort of German experience in the early 1920s, and then I want to talk about this debt monetization issue. And see, he makes an interesting point. Remember, this is written by basically this guy who wrote this book, this Shearer, was sort of like a, I don't want to call, maybe, do they call him a journalist? Let me see, I think that's what they call him. Yeah, he was a foreign correspondent, news commentator, historian. Yeah, he sort of worked with some, like, CBS and so on. And covered it. Yeah, so, but so he's not an economist, okay, but he did write something that's very important, because this will come back in a second when I talk about debt monetization. This is important. He did write that, this is page 61 and 62, the inflation could have been halted by merely balancing the budget, a difficult but not impossible feat. See, adequate taxation might have achieved this. Okay, in other words, what he's saying is we have a budget deficit. Governments were spending way too much money. So he's saying, well, maybe if we had raised the taxes, we could have made more money, right? But then he says, but the new government did not dare to tax adequately. So after all, the cost of the war, which was 164 billion marks, that's a lot of money, had been met not only in part by direct taxation, but 93 billion was in the form of war loans. So they borrow, 29 billion out of the treasury bills, and the rest by what? By increasing the issue of paper money. And there you go. So that's going to come back. Okay, so you notice that we have a situation where we have a government, lots of debt, just had a huge war, spent 164 billion marks, and you know, and is now printing lots of paper money. Okay, so, and it says here, instead of drastically raising taxes on those who could pay, the Republican government actually reduced them in 1921. Now then what he goes on and says was, I'm just going to sort of summarize this in the next paragraph, is that basically the big industrialists in Germany were actually in favor of this. He says they stood to gain. Yeah, so they were in favor of this. And of course, the rest of the masses of the population were basically completely destroyed. I mean, all their savings are now basically worthless. And so, you know, it's like all the money you saved all your life is now, doesn't buy anything. So the middle classes, the poorer people, are pretty much in trouble. Okay? Now, the reason this happened, he writes, is, well, this is what he says, moreover, the destruction of the currency, these marks, enabled German heavy industry to wipe out its indebtedness by refunding its obligations in worthless marks. Or so basically it's like, you know, we have all this debt, we can pay you back no problem, because I mean the money's worthless anyway. So it's kind of one way of these powers that be to sort of clean up their mess. And he also writes something that's very ominous. I guess it's much easier for us looking back, since we're in 2008, looking back something happened in the 1920s. But you can kind of see how what they're talking about is very ominous sounding. Then he talks about this, the army, right? Because they sort of had to keep this kind of secret, because apparently this was outlawed under the Versailles Treaty. Says that these the general staff took notice that the fall of the mark wiped out the war debts, right? Because now it's all just you know, worthless pieces of paper, right? So, and thus left Germany financially unencumbered for a new war. That's kind of an ominous sounding thing. They will wipe out the debt, destroy all the people's savings and all their money with this hyperinflation, right? And now we can just go have another war. Yikes! So that's what happened. So now I want to now switch gears. Let me put this book aside, pull out the next one. I want to talk about this idea of monetizing debt. Okay, and this is in this book where I sort of draw my ideas from. Blanchard Molino's book. I think it's a wonderful book. I read most of it. I love it, so I kept it. And now they talk about, in their chapter on inflation, they look at a whole bunch of countries, not just Germany. They do look at that situation that I just brought to you from the 1920s, but also other ones as well. In fact, there was probably the first one they looked at, I think, was the Continentals. This was back during the American Revolution. Was actually another important lesson in economics out of that time, was the Continental Congress created these Continental scrip, and basically it was worthless at the end. No one wanted it. And so anyway, so they looked at all these different historical incidents in America, Europe, and mainly, and this is basically what they said. To summarize the chapter for you in very simple terms, is that basically something has to shock in an economy, whether it's a war, it could be some sort of revolution, or something happens, and it forces the government into a high budget deficit scenario. In other words, the government is spending a lot more than it's bringing in through tax revenue. Okay, so it has to come up with a shortfall. It's not making enough through taxes, so it has to do something to get money, right? And so this is sort of what Shearer talked about in the history of the Germans, was that this is what happened then, was that they had this very high budget deficit, huge war debts, and so on. So they started just printing money. So that's basically the first step of this sort of model, is that you have a high budget deficit. Governments cannot borrow anymore, either because no one wants to lend them anything. That's usually the main reason, or they really just won't raise taxes, like the German story, right? They just wouldn't raise the taxes. So they've got this big budget deficit. They need money, they can't get it, so out of desperation they start basically printing money. The way this works, and I mentioned this sort of briefly before, is the government says, well, we want to borrow money. So they write up a bond, a piece of paper that says, I promise to pay you. And they sell it to their central bank. The central bank buys it, and it becomes an asset of the central bank. Now the central bank just creates the money out of thin air and hands it over to the government to go spend. Well, this of course leads to a high growth rate of money, which ultimately leads to a high growth rate of prices. In other words, high inflation. So basically the way that this, to summarize Blanchard and Molino, these guys, is basically high budget deficits that are sort of out of control, leading to high money growth, right? So we're printing lots of money, leading to high inflation. And that's basically, and then eventually that it becomes, if it gets high enough, it becomes hyperinflation. I'm going to stop this video clip now, and I'll carry on in, I guess, number 7, just to wrap this up, and then talk about the current environment and sort of some similarities between this and today.